I'm Sarah Peterson, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University at Buffalo. Today I'm presenting some preliminary work on modeling the dynamics of IPV, or intimate partner violence, in South Africa. In 2012, Oscar Pistorius was on top of the world. At the London Olympics, the South African athlete, nicknamed the Blade Runner, became the first amputee runner to compete in any Olympics. By 2016, however, everything had changed. In the early morning of February 14, 2013, Oscar Pistorius shot and killed his girlfriend, model Riva Steenkamp. Oscar Pistorius' murder of Riva Steenkamp was international news. How couldn't it be? He had the sensational mix of a fallen inspirational hero, a supermodel, a murderer. It was, in almost every respect, singular. And yet, in a critical way, the case wasn't singular at all. At the end of the day, it was the story of a woman who was killed by her partner. And that is a story that's all too common in South Africa, a country where more women are killed by intimate partners than in any other country in the world. This murder of women at the hands of their partners should be seen as part of a larger issue. This murder is a form of intimate partner violence, or IPV. It is undeniably an extreme form of IPV, but these murders certainly fit within the World Health Organization's definition. They are acts of violence within intimate relationships that cause the ultimate physical harm. And women all around the globe experience IPV in many different forms. Worldwide, an estimated 30% of women experience IPV at some point in their lifetime. In South Africa, however, that number is even higher. An estimated 45% of women in South Africa will experience IPV at some point in their lifetime. The high prevalence of IPV in South Africa has serious public health ramifications. IPV is linked to many mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. It is both directly and indirectly linked to many physical health issues. The acute health consequences of IPV include bruising, broken bones, and concussions. But IPV is also linked to long-term health issues, including chronic pain and gastrointestinal problems. These health issues may linger years, even decades, after the abuse subsides. South Africa's high rates of IPV have also been identified as a driver of the country's HIV and AIDS epidemic, which is one of the largest in the world. The country's rates of IPV have remained high despite the Domestic Violence Act, which was passed in 1988. This act expanded the legal protections available to women experiencing IPV and increased the repercussions for offenders. It made it easier for people to seek help, and it ostensibly made it easier for them to be separated from their abusers. But despite these legal protections, IPV in South Africa has been and continues to be a huge problem. There are a multitude of sociological theories that might offer different insight as to why IPV has historically been so high in South Africa. These theories have traditionally fallen into two main camps: feminist theories and family violence theories. At a high level, the key difference between these two groups of theories can best be understood as a difference in the scale at which they consider the problem, or, in other words, a difference in the boundary they draw around the issue of IPV. Feminist theories would draw large boundaries around the issue, pointing to broad structural factors as the key drivers of IPV in South Africa. These kinds of theories would point to apartheid's violent legacy and misogynistic cultural norms that leave women at a disadvantage within South African society. Family violence theories would draw small boundaries around the issue in question, pointing out the ways in which a woman's immediate environment conditions her risk of experiencing IPV. These kinds of theories would point to an intergenerational cycle of violence, where young boys and young girls witness IPV in their families and are more likely to grow up and perpetrate or experience IPV themselves. These theories would also point to issues of resource scarcity as drivers of IPV, suggesting that men who lack many resources often turn to relationship violence as a means of exerting power and control over others. In recent years, these theories have become increasingly focused on intersectionality, considering the ways in which different elements of people's identity intersect and collectively contribute to the risk of IPV. The social ecological model of IPV, which has widely been accepted within the public health sphere, builds upon this notion of intersectionality by considering IPV in terms of factors operating at multiple scales. In particular, the social ecological model focuses on the societal scale, the community scale, the interpersonal relationship scale, and the individual. An application of the social ecological model to the context of IPV in South Africa would inevitably lead to discussions of the multiscalar factors that result in disproportionately high rates of IPV in South Africa's townships and informal settlements. While all of South Africa struggles with the issue of IPV, these particular communities have exceptionally high rates of IPV. The social ecological model would look beyond simply the poverty in these communities to look at the other factors that are also important. Things like educational opportunities that are available, the misogynistic norms that are present in these communities, the gender-based stereotypes, and overall the neighborhood income levels. They all matter, and they all collectively contribute to environments that foster IPV. But even though the social ecological model acknowledges that there are many factors operating at multiple scales, it doesn't do very much to explain how these factors actually contribute to IPV. In the words of one critic, the social ecological model merely notices the multiple contexts and layers of factors affecting the incidence and prevalence of violent behavior or victimization. It is unclear within the ecological nesting which factors or levels are causal and are the most important in determining violence against women. In other words, the social ecological framework relies on what Barry Richmond called laundry list thinking. It assumes that IPV is simply the result of some checklist of causal factors, each of which acts independently to produce the outcome of IPV. This static way of thinking about IPV flies in the face of reality. The real world is full of dynamic systems, ongoing, interdependent, self-sustaining, dynamic processes. The interdependencies, the nonlinearities, the feedback processes, and the history dependence that characterize the phenomenon of IPV are hallmarks of complex systems. So, as a complex system, it's only appropriate that the issue of IPV be approached from a systems perspective. My work includes both a simple causal map diagram of the systems of IPV as well as a preliminary model based on one component of the causal map. Within this diagram, you can see some of the dynamics of the intergenerational transmission of IPV within communities. Exposure to IPV in childhood leads to a greater normalization and acceptance of IPV. As IPV is normalized, the number of relationships with IPV in the community increases. As the number of relationships with IPV in the community increases, the likelihood of an individual experiencing IPV in turn increases as well. This feeds back into more relationships with IPV in the community, reinforcing loop 2, and it also leads to people being exposed to IPV in childhood, closing reinforcing loop 1. These two reinforcing loops can be considered as part of a larger system. Without digging too much into the weeds here, this larger causal loop diagram considers the feedback between relationships with IPV and women's self-esteem, a negative link, self-esteem and achievement, a positive link, and women's achievement and the toxic gender narratives within communities, another negative link. The items touched upon in this causal loop diagram are all important considerations in the systems of IPV, and I hope to incorporate some of this feedback between the factors as a future direction of my modeling. However, the model I'm presenting today really focuses on the first feedback loop, looking at how IPV exists as an intergenerational issue in South Africa. This model starts with an aging chain of South Africa's female population, disaggregated into 7 different age classes. For each cohort, women can fall into one of 2 categories. They either have not experienced IPV or they have experienced IPV. Taking a look at the detail of a single age cohort, we can see that women who have not experienced IPV age into the top stock, whereas women who have experienced IPV age into the bottom stock of the structure. From there, women can either age out of either cohort and move on to the next age, or they can die at any given age. Women who have not experienced IPV can also experience IPV at any given age, moving them from the stock of not experienced IPV at the top of the structure to the stock of women who have experienced IPV in their lifetimes. The model that I built was calibrated based on assumptions that are designed to replicate South Africa's population dynamics as best as possible. The age classes in the model reflect young girls aged 0 to 9, early adolescent girls 10 to 14, teenage girls 15 to 19, young women aged 20 to 25, women in their later 20s, 25 to 29, women in their 30s and 40s, and women 50 and up. Of course, people can die at any given age. This model incorporates age-specific death rates based on data gathered from Statistics South Africa. These death rates indicate just over 6 deaths per thousand in girls younger than age 10, then fairly low death rates for teenage girls between age 10 and 20. The rates for women dying increase throughout their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then dramatically increase in women aged 50 and up. The model also makes some assumptions about when women first experience IPV in their lifetimes. An estimated 45% of South African women have experienced IPV at some point in their life. And while this estimate gives us some scope of the problem, at some point in their lifetime is a huge span of time. While it's possible that women might go several decades of their life and only experience IPV for the first time in their 50s or 60s, we know that the majority of women who experience IPV have had their first experience at a relatively young age. I used what little information I had to calibrate the model in terms of the rates at which women move from not having experienced IPV to experiencing IPV. The first thing I did with the model was put it into a dynamic steady state so that the population remained the same over the years. Assuming that women only gave birth from age 15 to 30, the years that they're most fertile, this put the yearly birth rate to just under 1,500 per woman per year, or a total fertility rate of 2.18 children per woman over the course of her childbearing years. But South Africa is growing quickly. If you recall from the image of South Africa's population pyramid, the pyramid had a very wide base. Given this demographic structure, without any policies to restrict South Africa's population growth, we can assume that the country will grow very quickly in the coming years. So I wanted to experiment to see what would happen with a very high birth rate, 0.25 babies per woman per year, with a total fertility rate of 3.75 babies per woman over the course of her lifetime. Comparing the results of this high birth rate with the steady state scenario, we first of all see what we would expect. South Africa's population grows rapidly throughout the rest of the 21st century. The impact of that higher birth rate on the absolute number of women experiencing IPV reflects the structure of the model, because the higher birth rates mean a larger population overall. But even though the absolute number of women having experienced IPV increases with the higher birth rate, the proportion of women actually decreases. When the birth rate is 0.25, the percentage of women who have experienced IPV is just 34%. This suggests that a growing population is likely to mask the true impact of IPV on the population. In other words, in order for a growing population such as South Africa's to experience constant IPV rates, as it has, the rates at which women experience IPV must be increasing. In fact, when we use South Africa's true population growth, we find that the percentage of women having experienced IPV is really only 43%, not 45%. But despite its growing population, South Africa's actually aging due to a decreasing total fertility rate over recent years. All else equal, a reduction in the overall birth rate might have a significant impact on the long-term dynamics of IPV. I tested the potential effects of a declining birth rate using two-step tests. The first test decreased the birth rate by 0.05 in the year 2050, reflecting a sudden and substantial decrease, approximately 30%, of births in that year. These figures show that a sudden substantial decrease in birth rates would have a significant impact on both the number and percent of South African women who had experienced IPV over time. Looking at the right graph, we can see that a drop in births would, over time, lead to more than 50% of women having experienced IPV in their lifetime. With the falling birth rates, there would be fewer and fewer women under the age of 15, those who are too young to have personally been affected by IPV. A similar dynamic is seen in the results from the second test, which decreased the birth rate by 0.02 in 2020 and then again by 0.02 in 2050. These two-step tests represent smaller yet still fairly substantial decreases in the country's birth rate. While the results of this test are not as dramatic as the previous slide, the dynamic is still largely the same, as the decreasing birth rate leaves a smaller fraction of the population unexposed to IPV. So this is all well and good, but what does it actually tell us? First, in order for South Africa's IPV rates to have remained high at 45% over time, young women now are likely to be experiencing IPV at higher rates than they have in the past. This behavior reflects the fact that the IPV fractions in this model are all set values, but future research might include incorporating some of the feedback seen here in this causal map diagram to address some of the dynamics that are actually driving IPV. Even without having incorporated all of these feedback loops, the insight gained from this preliminary model suggests that there is real value in using a systems approach to understand IPV in South Africa. These system frameworks allow us to understand not just what factors contribute to high rates of IPV in the country, but help us start thinking about how these systems work and what might be done to address this complex and multi-scalar issue over time.